I've always wanted to write a novel. If you've ever said that to yourself, then keep watching. Hi, my name's John Reynolds. A few years ago, I wrote a novel called Uncommon Enemy. And as a result of that novel, I thought I'd share my experiences with other would-be writers, because I learned a lot in the process of writing the novel. And so I wrote another little book called Writing Your First Novel. And here are a few guidelines that I developed in the process of writing your first novel. So what I'll do is I'll take you through the key stages of writing the novel, the stages that I went through, that I imagine are fairly typical of all novel writers, whether it's their first novel or their fifth novel or whatever. The stages, of course, will change from time to time, but basically this is how you go through it. You should write what you know about for your first novel. Yes, you might be tempted to go back into ancient Rome or something like that, but I would urge you to write about the environment that you know about, that you've researched, even one that you've grown up in. There's plenty of scope, there are plenty of environments that will provide you with material for your own novel, such as your workplace, your family, places you've been to, or anything really in your life that you think could form the basis for a good story. I did a lot of travelling and used that in Uncommon Enemy, but you don't have to travel all over the world. You can stay in your own place, in your workplace, among your family, as I said, and so on. You'll find lots of stories, conflicts, etc. Even in your local newspaper, it's always full of stories that could form the basis for your first novel. I often quote the case of Jane Austen, who wrote books that have sold in the millions, Pride and Prejudice being one of the most famous. She never left England. She stayed in England the whole time and moved pretty much around the same areas. Yet her stories, full of characters and love and marriage and tension between the characters and so on, has, as I've said, sold in the billions. And so she had the ability to draw on the people and the places that she knew. And so that's something that you could take advantage of and say, well, what is it about the people I know, the environment I live in, that would form the basis of an effective novel? What's your favourite genre? Everybody's got a favourite genre. You probably, like most of us, read various genres. But if you decide, okay, what's the one I really enjoy? You could use that as the basis for your first novel. Because you know the genre well, you've read lots of books in that genre, you know how it works. So that would be a good start for thinking about the concept of your first novel. Similarly, what appeals to you? That genre appeals to you. Why does it appeal to you? If you can write a novel that you think would appeal to other people because the idea, the characters, the story appeal to you, then that's a good start as well. So how do you make a start? Do you sit around and wait for the inspirational moment? No, that's not going to work. If you sit around and wait for the moment, it'll probably never come. If you want to be a writer, you need to write. I'll say that again. If you want to be a writer, you need to write. You need to sit down with your trusty pen or your computer open or whatever and start to write. Start to get some words down on paper. You will, of course, revise and revise again, as I'll say later on in this little program. You'll need to revise the work that you've written, but at least by writing, you've got going. You're thinking about the characters, you're thinking about the story and the way people are relating to each other within your novel. Time management is very important. If you're serious about your novel, you'll have to set some time aside for it, in between work commitments, family commitments, leisure time and everything else. But if you can find some time during the week, set yourself maybe a goal like 4 pages a day or 10 pages a week or something like that, and write maybe a few pages when you get home at night, wet Saturday afternoons, that sort of thing. Then your novel will gradually take shape. Sometimes you might think, oh, I don't really feel like writing it. But if you've got an hour to spare, sit down and have a go. If you want to be a writer, keep writing. The opening sentence of your novel is important. It will not only start to encapsulate what the novel is about, but will also encourage you'll read it to read the next sentence. It doesn't have to be complicated either. One of the most famous is from Charles Dickens's novel, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Very simple, but an interesting contrast that captures and grabs the reader's imagination. The best of times, the worst of times. So what's the story going to be about? Well, the curiosity of the reader is whetted, and so they begin to read. Another example from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a simple man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Now that tells you immediately what the novel's going to be about. It's going to be marriage and men seeking women, men with money trying to find a bride, and all the challenges and the pitfalls that involves, both for the man seeking the bride and the bride who may or may not be attracted to the man. So what about the plot, the storyline? You might think, well, I think I can have a go at writing a novel, but I'm not sure if I can develop a storyline. Now some writers sit down and they plan the whole storyline. They create a blueprint for their novel from the beginning, the middle to the end. And when they've done that, they start to write the novel. That wasn't my experience. I had a general idea of a country under German occupation in the Second World War, a democratic nation. How did people react? It was an alternative history. It didn't actually happen, but I decided I could make it feasible. And people told me it did, so it must have worked. Anyway, I didn't have the full plot worked out. I had the key characters, although they changed a bit as we went along, and I had some key scenes. So I just started to write. And as I wrote, say on a wet afternoon or in the evening, I found quite often the plot wrote itself. Now this wasn't magic, it was just that I got absorbed in what was happening, and another scene would suddenly pop into my mind, and I would start to write it. And gradually the novel developed. In some cases it was linear, in other words, one subplot followed another, one chapter followed another, but at other times I jumped ahead and thought, well, that'll make an interesting chapter, so I wrote that, and then later on put it in the right order after many modifications. So again, if you're not sure whether you can do a plot or not, have a go, start writing. It's in the telling. By that I mean it's the way you tell your story. Love stories follow a pretty simple formula. A couple meet, they're attracted by each other, they may be falling in love, then things go wrong, they may be quarrel, they may part for a short time, a long time, then they come back together again. That formula is as old as the hills. It's been going for years in novels and of course in movies, but it's the way the story is told. It's the setting, it's the characters, it's the way they talk to each other, the other people involved. So it's in the telling. So even if you think, well, my story is not that original, maybe not, but the way you tell it is going to be a crucial factor in writing your first novel. Somebody once wrote that a good fiction writer, a good storyteller, if you like, is a troublemaker. You should have trouble and strife in your novel. You should have problems all the time. Now, that doesn't mean your whole novel is riddled with angst, that people are worried the whole time and no one's laughing and enjoying themselves. No, of course not. But it's little problems, it's little challenges that keep the reader turning the page. It could be something huge like the outbreak of war, or someone's lost their car keys and they're running late for an appointment. But the reader will want to turn the page to see how that one's resolved. Then along comes another little problem, so they'll turn the page again. So always make sure you've got little troubles and big troubles in your novel. Of course, trouble and conflict doesn't necessarily need to come from external forces. It could come from within one of your characters. They're faced with a moral dilemma. Standard one, I suppose. They find a purse full of money and the person's name is inside the purse. So what do? Nobody knows they've got it. Do they give it back? Do they keep it? That's a personal dilemma, a personal conflict. And I'm sure you can think of many examples like that. So your characters, they're important. Your readers enjoy following the characters, seeing how they'll react, even empathizing with them, identifying with them. What would you do if you were in his position? Gosh, is that what he did? I didn't expect him to do that, and so on and so forth. Your characters should be interesting. They should be contrasting. Even if they're from the same background, they've both grown up in the same district, gone to the same school together and so on, make sure that they're distinctive. Think of the people at your workplace, the people in your family. They're all different, even if they're related. They all have different characteristics, different ways of behaving, different little foibles. Make sure that the characters in your novel also have differences. Similarly with your heroes and villains, don't make your hero all completely good and your villains all completely bad. Nobody's like that. Even the most villainous person in the world has a reason for why they behave like that. It could be something traumatic in their life, their childhood and so on. Similarly with your heroes. They've also got their flaws. So don't make your characters too two-dimensional. Make sure that they also have those human characteristics that we all have. So where do you find your characters? Well, it's relatively easy. You could find your characters from the people that you know. I've based some of my characters on real people. They'll never recognize themselves because as the novel progressed, so they changed. But I could imagine those people in those situations behaving the way they did. The good guys, the bad guys, and people in between. And so, for a start anyway, think of people that you already know and then base your novel on them. Dialogue. Dialogue's very important. It tells you about the people in the story, tells you about the characters and the way they react, the way they relate to each other. Dialogue is also important in terms of the age, the gender, the background, the culture, the education of the person that you're writing about. Let's take a simple example. Imagine that someone's telling somebody that they are a liar. Here's some examples. They could say, "You're a liar. You're a bloody liar. You're a lying bastard. I don't believe you. My dear fellow, surely you lie. Are you sure you've got your facts straight?" Each one of those could be used by one character to tell the other character that they're lying. So that an elegant, well-educated university professor would not call someone a lying bastard any more than a cowboy in a Western novel would turn to the other cowboy and say, "My dear fellow, surely you lie." So your dialogue has to fit your character. Dialogue's been called an intensification of everyday speech. By that it means that you don't have the ums and the ahs and the you knows and the likes, all those little words that we sprinkle in our dialogue when we're talking to people, we backtrack and that sort of thing. With dialogue, keep it clean, keep it simple, keep it moving forward. Here's a couple of examples from Uncommon Enemy, my novel. In this scene, Stuart and Brendan, who are in a guerrilla group, have captured a couple of soldiers who have a truck. The soldiers have said they'd like to join the guerrilla group, and Stuart and Brendan are not quite certain. This is how the first draft of this little scene went. "Come with us, Stuart," murmured Brendan. "You're sure? It's a hell of a risk." "Yes," replied Stuart, "but as you've already said, we've got a distance and transport problem." I had another look at it and I thought, it's a tense situation, and here's Stuart making sort of pompous pronouncements. So I changed it. I changed his line. So I had Brendan again saying, "Come with us, Stuart," murmured Brendan. "You're sure? It's a hell of a risk. Their truck would be useful." So from Stuart's 13 words, "Yes, but as I've already said, you've got a distance and a transport problem," I cut it down to 4. Their truck would be useful. So dialogue should be short and succinct. So when you've written a section of dialogue, you should read it aloud. In fact, even get some other people to read some of the parts with you and listen to them. Have they said what they said with impact, Does it make sense? Have they used too many words? Could you shorten it? Is the dialogue appropriate to the character, the age, the background, the ethnicity, and all those other aspects? So dialogue, although you're not writing for a medium like film where people will actually hear it, they'll hear it in their heads. And so you need to make sure that what they hear in their heads as they're reading it is appropriate and makes impact. The American writer Carl Sandburg described slang this way. Slang, he said, is a language that rolls up its sleeves, spits on its hands, and goes to work. Now, slang can vary enormously. Slang varies between the generations. Teenage slang has a variation from their parents' slang and their grandparents' slang. Slang in some countries is different from slang in other countries. Slang in cultures, even if the same language, varies. Subcultures have their own slang. New York gangsters have different slang, I guess, from gangsters in London and so on and so forth. So if you're writing slang, make sure it's appropriate to the time and the place and the era. So you've got your plot, you've got your characters, and you've got your dialogue. But you've got to write your descriptive passages as well, because they're the setting, they're the environment for your characters and how they react to each other and how they react to their environment. Very important. The challenge is to create a clear picture of the environment, whether it's a teenager's bedroom or the throne room of an emperor. I think, for me anyway, the easiest way to do that is to imagine it in your own mind and then describe it to your readers. Adjectives and verbs are very useful in your writing. They just add a bit more body to what you're trying to say. Here's a couple of examples from my novel. Slow, undulating shapes. The familiar throb of the engines. He peered into the sodden gloom. A discord of foreboding. Now I could have had him peering into the gloom, but I wanted the sodden gloom because it had been a thunderstorm and the ground, the environment was still very wet. Similarly, the slow undulating shapes, these were flags on the roof of a building, and they were slow and they were undulating. I could have just said the shapes of the flags, but the adjectives added to it. Similarly with verbs, the group huddled together. He felt a shudder of anticipation. He eased himself between the glowering pair. So these two guys were about to fight, and Stuart, one of the main protagonists, tried to separate them. So he eased himself between the glowering pair. I thought was a better way of saying, basically he pushed in between them. If you're not sure whether the adjective works, but you've got an idea in your mind that it might work, go to your thesaurus. It should be at your right hand the whole time, or you can find it, of course, on many websites. Use your thesaurus all the time, and it will expand your vocabulary and avoid you repeating yourself. Love and sex. Describing intimate details of lovemaking between two characters is often quite challenging for the writer. After all, it's not something you discuss around the dinner table, but nevertheless, love and sex are very important in telling us about the people. But there is an important distinction between love and sex. In fact, somebody once wrote that love is a matter of chemistry and sex is a matter of physics. So let's have a look at it. Love is an expression. Love is an expression of the relationship between two people, how they feel about each other. Sex, well, that can be rape, unfortunately, or prostitution, or just a one-night stand. Quite different from lovemaking. So you as the writer need to decide what's the context, the two people participating. Why are they having sex together? Why are they making love? Is there a difference? And if so, how are you going to describe it? When you're thinking of writing a love scene, or you feel that that's important in the novel, ask yourself these questions. Does the love scene advance the story? Does it give the reader a greater insight into the characters? What sort of love or sex would be appropriate? Slow, gentle, or raunchy, if you like. Will it be satisfying to both, or will it result in doubt, fear, uncertainty, which is all part of life? Here are a few guidelines when writing about love and sex. Avoid medical terms for private parts. You're not writing a health department pamphlet. Foreplay is important. Don't just dive straight into it, because that tells you about the characters and how they feel about each other. Gives the reader a greater insight into them. Avoid exaggerated euphemisms like rod of pleasure and rod of manhood and garden of delight and that sort of thing. It doesn't add much. And use dialogue appropriately in lovemaking. No, it's not a horse race, it doesn't require a commentary, but often a few words of love or murmurings said by one character to another can just add a bit more insight into the character and flesh it out a bit, if you'll pardon the pun. It doesn't have to end in a shuddering climax, it may well do, but often, as I think I said earlier, it can leave people perhaps less than satisfied, full of doubts and uncertainties, which is life itself, I guess. But when writing love scenes, well, you can enjoy yourself. After all, you're an active participant. There are a vast number of books written on grammar and parts of speech. Here are a few guidelines. When you're using verbs, for example, use action verbs. The person didn't just go, they ran, they scrambled, they staggered, they crawled. Use lots of verbs that convey action to the reader. Adverbs are words that end in ly, and it's very tempting for writers to sprinkle their prose with adverbs just in case the reader doesn't get the point. But you don't always need adverbs. You can do without them quite often. Here's an example from Uncommon Enemy. In this line, I put an adverb in it. "I'm going to kill you," he whispered quietly. When I came to reread it, I should say, a few weeks later, I decided we don't need quietly, because he whispered. So how else would he say it? So I left it out. "I'm going to kill you," he whispered. And that worked. Attention to detail is important if you're writing any sort of environment, whether it's current or historical, or even if you're getting into futuristic writing. You still need to describe the key objects within your environment. And that may require you to do some research, whether it's a Western bar, a Victorian drawing room, or a hospital surgery. It will also help you show how things have changed over the years. For example, I had Stuart sitting down at university studying for his final exams, and during my research I discovered that smoking was permitted inside the university library during the 40s, something that would never happen now. And so I added that in just to show how different things were and add a bit more colour to it, if you like. So it went like this. Finding a spot by the library window, Stuart spread his notes on the desk, lit a cigarette and began reading. Imagine it these days. The climax of your novel is when everything comes together, when you have a resolution of the characters or the events or both, because you can't really separate one from the other. For some people that's the hardest. It was for me. I wrote 6 different endings before I was happy with it. And I let it just gel away in the back of my mind, because the novel took me about 2 years to write, in between earning a living and all those sorts of things. But eventually I was happy with it. But it took a while. Don't panic if you can't think of how to end it. And you don't have to tie everything up. It can be a happy ending, a sad ending, a thoughtful ending. You could leave the reader with, the reader could put the book down and say to themselves, okay, I wonder what happened next. In other words, they've accepted that that's the end of your book, but not everything's tied up. And so that's something, don't panic over the climax. It'll come, it doesn't have to resolve everything. Reviewing. You should review your book. You should review it chapter by chapter, paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, and word by word. If you think that sounds like a chore, well, not really. It's your book. You want to make it as good as you can. You want to make it flow, you want to make it tight, you want to make it work so the reader will get involved in it. So even if you let it just sit around for a week or so before you go back to it and read it again, try and read it with fresh eyes, get other people to read it for you if you like. Some writers don't like to share their writing, but I did. I gave it to my wife to read. She's my strongest critic, but she knows what she's talking about it. My sons read it, some of my friends read it, and they all made their comments. Be careful though, when somebody offers some criticism, don't start justifying it to them. Just listen to what they say. They're a potential reader. So don't feel you've got to keep justifying it. After all, you're not going to be next to every reader who reads your novel. Accept their criticism. It's your novel. You can decide whether the criticism is valid, but certainly listen to it, because you could find it invaluable. Your title is crucial. In a few words, it encapsulates the essence of your book. It takes a while sometimes to come up with a good title. In my case, I used several titles until I was reading the newspaper one morning. It was about some trouble in the Middle East, and the words uncommon enemy were used in a sentence. I thought, that's it. I'll use that for the title of my book. So you can get your titles from all sorts of places, or quotes from other people, or even from the book itself. As you start to write, there may be a line or a couple of words that work well. Some of my favourite titles, here you are. Frederick Forsyth's The Day of the Jackal. I like that one. That suggests fear and menace. In contrasting titles, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, or Dostoevsky, the Russian writer, one of his most famous books was Crime and Punishment. So, you've finished your novel. It may make you a fortune, you may just break even, or maybe not make any money at all. But there's an enormous amount of satisfaction of holding your novel in your hand or seeing it up on a site as an e-book. And, of course, being able to say, drop into a conversation, oh, my last novel was about so-and-so, or, yeah, I've just finished a novel. I find people are always very interested to know about your novel. Don't bore them witless by starting to describe it in great detail, but you'll find, particularly among family and friends, that they're pretty supportive of the fact that you've written a novel. And it's very satisfying. It's your novel. It's your creation. And it may encourage you to go on and write other novels. I've got lots of additional advice and guidance in my book, Writing Your First Novel, which, like my novel Uncommon Enemy, you can download from these websites. You might also like to check out my own website to give you a bit more background and information. If you decide to go ahead and embark on the challenging but exciting, and in my experience a very rewarding journey of writing your first novel, then I wish you every possible success.